In session 5, we are engaging with the religiously plural and secular worlds. Paradoxically, our world is both religiously plural and secular. In many ways, pluralism is a fact of life, and we live with it at so many levels. Nelson Mandela described the new South Africa as a rainbow nation. The island of Ireland is increasingly pluralistic, north and south, and the United Kingdom is so pluralistic that some want to take back control of borders and reduce migration, which also means being more mono-British, whatever that means. The United States has long been described as a melting pot, but Trump also wants to build a wall and keep certain people out. Because we have lived through the decline of Christendom and its hegemonic system of belief and orthodoxy, we have forgotten, if we ever knew, that early Christianity was diverse and plural, with the Christian Testament itself reflecting a diversity and plurality of liturgies and Christologies. There are many Christianities, many Judaisms, many Islams, many forms of Hinduism and Buddhism, and religions themselves are plural, as are cultures and identities. Pluralism is a fact of life. This is why, from a Christian or any religious perspective, we no longer do theology or public theology by ourselves. Faith communities don't talk to themselves, not in today's world. We have done for a long time in the Atlantic West, but people who talk to themselves become odd, eccentric. We begin to sound funny. And that is how increasing numbers of people today hear our theological conversations. We talk to ourselves and think the world understands us. When Christendom was alive, we could do that, and we could ignore other religions, even dismiss them as false, if not evil. The world is more obviously plural than we may want to recognize. When we think, speak, write, sing and pray as Christians, we need to recognize that we are a particular religious tradition and not the only religious tradition. We may have been born into a Christian tradition, and if we remain there, our faith needs a constantly renewed decision. If we say a yes to the Christian faith, we do so knowing that we could say yes to other available faiths or no faith. We may also need to recognize that people say yes to other religious traditions because that faith for them is liberating and spiritually fulfilling. Or they may opt to become secular humanists or atheists, and their decision is also a moral decision. We are Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Confucianists, secular humanists, agnostics, or atheists in the midst of each other. The challenge of our globalized pluralist world and society is a formidable one of rethinking our relationship to these others. We now have to ask ourselves about the beliefs and values they embrace and what it is drives and inspires them, but also what it is that we embrace and what are the values and spirituality that make us tick. As Canadian Christian theologian Douglas John Hall put it, we do our theology from now on in the midst of others. Let's look at that, doing public theology in the midst of others. To do public theology in the midst of others is to do theology in the presence of and with world religions. All the religions of the world are now present on every continent. They are globalized religions. We used to think that a religion was a Western or Eastern religion, but all religions are now globalized. Christianity was for a long time a Western religion. Christendom was a Western phenomenon, but the greater numbers of Christians are now no longer in Europe, but on other continents. World religions are now neighbour religions. Many are now present in Ireland. Locally and globally, we face huge problems like poverty, violence, war, climate change, and environmental degradation. These are the great publics of public theology, which will not be solved by one government or by one religion. Now do hear this in the now local global context. Christianity alone will not save the planet. Neither will Islam flying solo, nor will any government acting alone. We need partnerships, collaboration, shared ethical resources, and action. Public theology will include a theology of religions. Oikumene, the Greek from which we derive the word ecumenical, really means the whole community of life. In an earlier session, we quoted the Catholic Bishop of Brussels, who said that when the European churches made representation together to the European Parliament or Commission, it was not to advocate for the church, but for the human. Back in 1963, Christian ethicist Paul Lehman said that God is at work in the world to make and keep human life human. Lehman was really saying that God is not concerned with the exclusive spread of Christianity, but with human flourishing. God is active in the world, not advocating for the church, but for the human. A later ethicist, Gordon Kaufman, asked the question, how shall we build a new and more human world for all the people of the world? This, he said, is our most important question. Now, we might want to say more than Lehman or even Kaufman said, since we are now much more aware of the ecological destruction caused mainly by humans. The flourishing and future of the human community and of the earth are inextricably linked. Paul realized that in the 1st century CE, he realized this when he wrote his letter to the Romans. There is no salvation or wholeness for humans apart from the salvation and wholeness of the earth, and no liberation for the earth apart from liberation for humans. We are all in it together, and we are in it together with the neighbor religions. Japanese Christian theologian Kozuke Koyama perceptively said, Christ does not ask us to behave as a prima donna among other religions. Christianity is no longer militant, imperialistic, or monopolistic. The Christ who refused dominating power or power over, according to the early Christian hymn of Philippians chapter 2, does not ask us to dominate other religions or think we are superior to other religions. That is not the mind of Christ. What is important is that, as Wolfhart Pannenberg said, if religion is to regain its public authority, it has to appropriate the spirit of pluralism without losing its identity. We do public theology in the midst of other religions, in dialogue with other religions, each bringing our core beliefs and ethics to the round table. At the table, we are not any less Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or whatever. We each bring to the table our beliefs, values, and spiritualities, ready to hear the other and to be ourselves self-critical. Dialogue is the word between us, a process of listening and speaking. We do not ignore the ambiguities in our histories, in our sacred texts and relationships. We search for the commonalities and the shared ethical values. We speak with different accents and nuance things in different ways. On the table will be the outer forms of our religions and also the inner realities. The latter are important because these are our spiritualities, the deepest realities in which are the values of the tradition, which also take us to the ethical heart of the respective traditions. The dialogue is a dialogue of ethics and action, which takes place in the public square and is a search for civility, human and environmental flourishing. Doing public theology in the midst of and with each other is especially important for the Abrahamic religions. Already in this course, there has been significant focus on Judaism, with intentional reading of the Hebrew Bible on its own terms and not overlaid by Christian interpretation or the distortions of Christian interpretation. The last 60 years have seen intense Jewish-Christian dialogue, which was demanded by the horror of the Holocaust or Shoah. After that unspeakable evil in Christian Europe, Jews and Christians had to engage, and they did with huge advances in understanding of each other and why history has been as it was between Christians and Jews. Jesus and Paul, as radical Jews rooted in their Jewish tradition, is now commonplace. The next 60 years require an equally intense dialogue between Christians and Muslims. The imperative arises from the globalization of the two religions. The imperative arises from that globalization and Islamist extremism and violence and the prejudice and misrepresentation of Islam by much of the Western media, and not forgetting the bitter legacies of Western imperialism and colonialism. There are troubled histories and legacies of hate, ambiguities of interpretation in our sacred texts, but there are also shared roots of faith, crossover sacred texts, and shared ethical and public values. The core words and visions of justice and peace are central to the Hebrew Bible, Christian Testament, and Quran. Compassion, mercy, right relations based on justice, and the rich community, relational, and economic vision of covenant are all common Jewish, Christian, and Islamic currency. These are also public, social ethics and values. The Abrahamic traditions are all prophetic traditions, religions of social responsibility, with a primary responsibility of social justice. An Abrahamic public theology is possible. And there are other religions at the round table with all their ambiguities and potentialities. The rise of China and the movement among Chinese people to recover their Confucian tradition makes dialogue with Confucianism an imperative. In 1893, the Parliament of World Religions met in Chicago. It was an indication of a shrinking world. Between 1914 and 1945, that world was shattered. It was a century before the Parliament of World Religions met again in larger and more representative numbers. Indigenous religions were present in 1993. Influential at Chicago 1993 was Catholic theologian Hans Kuhn. There were many others, but his was the vision of a shared global ethic necessary to deal with the world's agony and fear and destruction. A declaration towards a global ethic emerged from Chicago, not as a new global ideology or an attempt to form a single world religion. It wasn't the invention of a new morality to be imposed on the world's religions. It was a minimal ethic necessary for human and planetary survival. There is no new global order without a new global ethic, and all have a responsibility for a better global order. By a global ethic, the Chicago Parliament of World Religions meant a fundamental consensus on binding values, irrevocable standards, and personal attitudes. The Parliament has continued to meet every 5 or so years in different world locations. The most recent one was held in Toronto from the 1st to the 7th of November 2018. The theme, the promise of inclusion, the power of love, pursuing global understanding, reconciliation, and change. Kuhn himself has said that there is no peace in the world without peace between the world's religions, and there is no peace between the world's religions without dialogue between the world's religions. Religious pluralism is a reality of our globalized world, and religions are key ethical players in a situation of many religions and one world or planet. It is many faiths and one home. Religions are not marginalized from public life. There is the specificity of religions and the imperative of religious engagement with the wider community, society, and world. All religions need a reality check, and we need to recognize the transnational dimensions of religion as well as the importance of religious inclusivity. All of that adds up to the imperative of interfaith dialogue. Religion is public, and theology is public. There is nothing private about religion and theology. There is nothing private either about the spirituality and ethical value of religion. They emerge in social contexts, are shaped by social contexts, and contribute to social flourishing at their best. Public theology, or however the religions describe it, is theology, ethics, and values engaged with the life of the world. It is shaped in today's globalized world in the midst of each other, with each other, and through interfaith dialogue of actions and ethics. 2 group discussion questions. Public theology is an interfaith activity. What does this mean for the Christian community? What are the challenges and difficulties and opportunities? And the second, what would an Abrahamic public theology look like? What would it say about God? And what would its shared ethics and values look like?